Hello and welcome to the Providence College Podcast. I'm Liz Kay. The month of October was filled with a variety of great virtual events as part of PC's Homecoming at Home, and we can't blame you if you couldn't keep up with them all. One highlight was a discussion with composer and activist Joel Thompson about his celebrated work, The 7 Last Words of the Unarmed. This powerful music for chorus and chamber orchestra, written in 2014, commemorates unarmed members of the Black community who died due to police violence. The headline on the New York Times feature on Thompson's work was, he turned I Can't Breathe into protest music. It noted that Thompson's music echoes the liturgical structure of Haydn's The Last 7 Words of Christ.
With composer Joel
Dr.
Thompson.
Krishan Oberoi,
I'm really excited
PC's
to have
new
here.
director of
Actually,
choral
he is
activities,
here in
moderated the
Providence,
discussion,
just
which
miles
addresses the
away
role
from
of
our
art
campus.
and music as a
Originally,
force
he
for
was gonna
social
be with us
change.
on campus, and because of things, complications, he's had to be slightly off campus tonight. But welcome. Well, it's so great to have you here in town.
Honored to be here. Thank you so much.
Tonight we're going to be focusing our discussion on a composition by Joel Thompson, The 7 Last Words of the Unarmed. It's a composition for men's chorus and chamber orchestra. And I'll start by saying that as a new faculty here at Providence College, I'm just thrilled to be able to talk about this piece. My official position here at PC is Director of Choral Activities. And part of my mission is really to highlight the work that's being done today by composers like Joel that really reminds us how relevant choral music can be and how powerfully it can impact the society that we live in. So for that reason, I'm really excited to share this piece with you tonight, and also to have Joel here to share his insights into not just this piece, but the composer's role in society as well. So what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about how I first learned about Joel Thompson and his work, and then we'll take a quick look at just an excerpt from the piece, and then I'm going to hand it over to Joel and let him talk about the piece from his perspective. As a conductor, I'm always looking for new repertoire and repertoire that I think is going to excite the ensemble and to engage our audiences. In 2017, I was working as a research assistant at Boston University, and I was working alongside my mentor, Andre de Quadros, on his book called Global Perspectives in Choral Music. And in that book, there's a section devoted to the work of Eugene Rogers. Dr. Rogers is the conductor at University of Michigan. And in discussing Dr. Rogers' work, we touched on his premiere and his commission of The 7 Last Words of the Unarmed by Joel Thompson. So as part of this, working on this book, I had an opportunity to interview Dr. Rogers, and we got into the conversation about the piece. And I came away from that conversation thinking, wow, that is a piece that I need to really check out. So I went online, I checked out the piece, and I was blown away by it. And I looked up Joel, and we got in touch, and Joel, you and I spoke on the phone. I think it was 2018 at that point. We began to talk about maybe bringing him up to Stonehill College, where I was teaching at the time. And that didn't quite pan out with the timing. But as I began my work here at PC in August, I was thinking about repertoire again, and again, this piece, The 7 Last Words, came into my mind, and I thought, let me reach out to Joel and see if maybe he'd like to visit us at Providence College. He was willing to come to Stonehill. It's not that much of a difference to come up to Providence, and Joel was willing to come up, and so here we are. So with that, let me show you an excerpt from the beginning of this piece, 7 Last Words of the Unarmed by Joel Thompson, and then you'll have a chance to hear from the composer himself. So we saw Dr. Eugene Rogers conducting the University of Michigan Men's Glee Club in the premiere of Joel Thompson's Seven Last Words of the Unarmed. Joel, I want to give it over to you and give you an opportunity to talk about how this piece was born. Maybe tell us a little bit about the structure and the genesis of the piece.
Sure. Well, I wrote the piece, and in the winter break between 2014 and 2015, I was teaching at a small college in South Georgia at the time. And in November of 2014 was when the Staten Island grand jury chose not to indict the officer whose actions led to the death of Eric Garner. And that year had been a rough year in terms of these deadly interactions with law enforcement, between Black men and law enforcement. But it was that decision that was what broke me. And the idea of the piece, the emotional impetus of the piece was born right there. I felt that if I were in the same position as Eric Garner, that my family shouldn't expect justice. Even if it was filmed on camera and it was obvious I was alive at the beginning of the interaction and dead at the end, that not even a charge of negligent homicide or manslaughter should be expected by those that love me. And so I took to Twitter and found a pictogram series by Iranian-American journalist by the name of Shirin Bargi, who called it the Last Words series. And she would pair a simple image with the last words of an unarmed Black man killed by an authority figure of some sort. And I thought it was very moving, just seeing a simple image of a bird in flight, or a light bulb or a tangle of knots paired with the last words that a human being spoke before they ceased to exist. And so I decided to make a musical version of that. And given that there is the liturgical template of the Seven Last Words of Christ that has been set to music multiple times in the classical canon by Schütz and Haydn, notably, I decided to try my hand at that and use that template in order to make sense of things for myself. I was a choral conductor at the time, and I did not call myself a composer. And so I was not aware of an audience. I didn't intend for anyone to really listen to it. And so for that reason, just listening to it a while ago, that little excerpt, I'm reminded of how raw and vulnerable I was in the creation of it. It's as if someone's reading my diary entry every time I hear it, because it's from the depths of my soul. I don't mean to romanticize it that much, but I mean it's still difficult to this day for me to listen to, as it would be for anyone, I think, if you wrote down your deepest feelings on a piece of paper and had it performed. That's sort of what it's like for me. But the piece has had a life of its own since I've let it go in 2015 to Dr. Rogers, who premiered it in November of 2015. And it's been wonderful and humbling to see the effect it's had on the communities that have been chosen to engage with it.
Yeah. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the structure of the piece. So the idea of taking Haydn's Seven Last Words of Christ from the Cross, and I just set this up for anyone who's not familiar with that. It's sort of as you mentioned, a liturgical template going back to the 17th century, where composers would take, it's not exactly the seven last words, but the seven last statements of Christ from the cross, and set those statements to music in seven movements. And as you said, Heinrich Schütz, Joseph Haydn, both have famous settings of that text. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about, taking that template and infusing it with this new meaning.
Yeah, I think some people get a little uncomfortable when I mention that that is the template, given its association to the figure of Christ, which is very important in the Christian tradition, obviously. Um, but it's almost, the question is, am I deifying these men? But no, for me, the liturgy of the seven last words of Christ humanizes the figure of Jesus to me. He's saying things like, I'm thirsty, which is something I've said. And so I wanted to provide the same lens of humanity as we look at the lives of these men and how they were taken, that I feel that lens of humanity was robbed or ignored in the aftermaths of their deaths. And so this was a way for me to organize the chaos of all the grief and pain and anger that I was feeling, but also a way for me to focus on their humanity. And so I followed, I pretty simply made a Word document and I put the liturgy in one column, and using Shirin Barghi's research, journalistic research, and her Last Words project, chose last words that I felt would fit with the liturgy. And so I think the most obvious connection is the third saying in the liturgy, where Jesus is speaking to his mother and his beloved disciple John from the cross. He's saying, Mary, this is mother, this is thy son, and son, this is thy mother, basically saying, take care of each other while I'm gone, because he's about to die. I chose Amadou Diallo's last words, which he recorded in a voicemail to his mom, Mom, I'm going to college. And there's that same maternal connection from the liturgy to the piece. A simple statement like, I'm thirsty, is akin to a very simple statement like Oscar Grant III's last words, you shot me. And the most poetic one, I suppose, is the last saying in the liturgy is, into thy hands I commend my spirit. And it's fitting that since his death and lack of justice was the emotional impetus for the piece that I chose, Eric Garner's last words, I can't breathe, that connection of spirit and breath was the connection for me in the liturgy. And so that organization was the first thing I did before I wrote a single note. It happened soon after the decision, but I had to conduct my own lessons in carols and grade finals. And so I didn't really put pencil to paper until my winter break, that 2-week stretch.
Yeah, I want to follow up on some of the things you talked about, just the correlation between the seven last words of Christ and the way you've organized these seven statements. So I have a little document here, it's just side-by-side comparison, where on the left-hand side you can see the seven last words of Christ from the cross as they appear in the liturgy, and then the way Joel has organized the seven last words of the Unarmed. And yeah, like you said, the connection of number 3 certainly might be the most explicit, as Jesus is addressing his mother, Amadou Diallo addressing his mother. But I think, just as you suggested, that there are corollaries between each movement. And I think because you mentioned it, I really want to take a look at movement 3 and share some of that music, because I think it's so powerful. As we're going on, for those of you who are watching, feel free to drop questions in the Q&A as we're going on here. And as we get to the end of the conversation, we'll allow a little time to answer those questions, but you can drop them in any time. Now we'd like to look at another excerpt from the piece. We're going to look at the third movement, the last words of Amadou Diallo. Yeah, I think the sense of promise, of embarking on this new endeavor, going to college, and then, of course, the lost possibility or dashed hope of seeing that come to fruition is absolutely heartbreaking. And the way
Yeah.
you put the text there. You mentioned the final movement as well, and well, I just want to say, actually, before we get to that, you said that you felt that this humanizes the way you've set the text sort of humanizes the figures that we're dealing with. But I wonder if we might look at that from the reverse and say, rather than say the liturgy sort of humanizes Jesus and this is comparable, I actually feel like the way you treat this, it elevates those last words, and it reminds us of the divinity that's in every human being, and what's been extinguished when
Right.
life is taken.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. I totally agree. I think my aims as a composer in that moment, um, you know, deciding to write the piece, it, even though I was sort of framing it as humanizing the men, I was chasing after my own humanity. That I felt that the predominant feeling after that decision was that my life is worthless. Like that someone could literally kill me and nothing would happen. And now I'm used to that feeling. I mean, Breonna Taylor just the other week, like the same feeling of the neighbor's wall is worth more than her life. That it's so easy for us to find excuses to justify her death rather than mourn the fact that there is, rather than find accountability for the fact that she is no longer living and did nothing to deserve the theft of her life. It's easier for us to find excuses than to acknowledge that. And so there is a sense of worthlessness that undergirds a lot of the emotional impetus of this piece. And so in seeking their humanity, I'm also seeking my own. It was a way for me, it was a cathartic experience for me because I was able to exercise my grief and look at it from various angles, like a diamond, from various facets, put it on the table, and then leave and move on with the rest of my life. I was in a very dark, deep place. Writing this piece, I don't want to romanticize the fact that I was not as aware of techniques of self-care at the time of writing this. In the span of 2 weeks, I was obsessively reading and researching the lives of each of these men. If there was video footage of their death, I was watching it. In the case of Oscar Grant III, there were multiple cell phone angles available on YouTube of his death in a BART police station, prone on the ground, handcuffed, and someone shooting him in the back, the police officer shooting him in the back. Yeah, I wouldn't recommend that for anyone. I went to that dark place, and once I was done with the piece, I was fine. It was outside of me, and I moved on. And it was only until Freddie Gray died the following April that I was like seeking that same catharsis. So then I put a call out on Facebook and said, anyone want to sight read this piece I wrote last winter? And people showed up. My brother is a great violinist. He was in a string quartet at the time, got his string quartet to play. I played piano, got a conducting colleague to conduct. And after we sight read the work, someone called to Dr. Rogers and said, "You need to do this piece." And he came down to Atlanta, visited me, had tea. We talked about it. He gave me like a month to think about the prospect of letting my diary go and have him take it and premiere it the following November. But I eventually said yes. I trusted him. And this diary entry about feeling worthless and completely despondent and wrapped up in grief and pain and anger, and then seeking humanity, my own humanity through that process, was then handed over to a conductor in Michigan, a state I'd never been to, and he brought it to life, and the rest is history. It sort of kicked off my composition career. But I do definitely agree with that perspective, though, that it does elevate the men, and that's almost a subversive act in that I'm doing it in classical music, which has historically marginalized people that look like us. And so, yeah.
I want to talk about that for sure. But yeah, I mean, I just think this is a piece that does everything that, we hope music will do, choral music will do. We want it to move people and to get them to think about things in a different way, and to sort of soften their resistance if they have that on this issue. For me, it's impossible to listen to this piece and to not be moved and to not see yourself in it, your own humanity in it. And I think that's what, I find one of the things I find so compelling about the piece is that it's very easy to dismiss, CNN or Fox News or whatever that news network is that you love to hate, and just, to say, well, they're telling us their slanted view of the story, so I don't have to feel bad about this thing that's happening because there's probably all these other factors that they're not telling us.
Right.
Cuts through all that and gets right to the core of, listen, an innocent life is taken, and I don't feel like there's anyone that can experience this piece and not feel that sense of heartbreak. And hopefully that translates into, maybe it changes the way they think about this issue.
Yeah. I definitely like thinking about the piece as an invitation to empathy. It doesn't do all the work, for sure. I think I'm hoping that in my vulnerability, it encourages others to be just as vulnerable. And it's not easy. It's very difficult for me to listen to it to this day. And I don't expect it's easy for anyone to listen to it for the first time. But I think the solution to our present circumstance is not easy either. It requires us listening to each other with the same vulnerability that the piece invites us to engage with. So it's good practice, I think.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Let me circle back to something that Dr. Rogers said in the book that Andre and I worked on together. He's quoted as saying that he doesn't think this is a political issue or a political stance, in the sense that the piece itself or his presentation of the piece is not meant to be political. And he goes on to say, "I hesitated before taking this piece to my glee club. I did not want them to think I was pushing an agenda. At the same time, repertoire that deals with issues of social justice is important to me. It's part of my philosophy of teaching." And then he goes on to say that this engages our audience, builds a strong sense of community amongst our singers, and can foster a sense of Ubuntu, as Nelson Mandela defined the philosophy. Ubuntu holds that our personal humanity is dependent on the humanity of others. I think that's an incredibly eloquent and diplomatic statement from Dr. Rogers.
Yeah.
What do you think? I almost feel like, sometimes we think political is a dirty word. Certainly for me, this trans politics, as I just said, I don't think anybody can ignore this. It's a universal issue. It's a fundamental human issue. But on the other hand, there are, as you well know, incredibly divisive conversations that happen around this issue. So how do you see yourself in this piece, in that, political or overly politicized, let's say,
Right.
climate that we live in right now?
Yeah. I think I should, I mean, it is just a fact, at least from my perspective, that my identity as a Black man in the United States of America is inherently political. It's due to the country refusing to acknowledge itself, to have a reckoning with itself, that my identity is inherently political. If I as a Black composer chose to write about butterflies or birds or ships pulling into harbor instead of writing about this scourge that is afflicting the Black community, that would be a political decision on my part. That I'm choosing to elevate something that is not dominating the conversation that is a part of our community. And so, yeah, I know Dr. Rogers is being quite diplomatic, and because that's his job. But I think as a composer, an artist on the ground or whatever, I don't know. I can be a little bit more straightforward and say, honestly, I wasn't thinking about politics when I wrote the piece, but I was afraid that this conversation would happen when I let it go and gave it to Dr. Rogers, and it happened on a stage, and he got feedback from alums of the Glee Club saying that this is not the place for that. This is too political. This is classical music isn't the place for this sort of polemical political stuff. But it's so easy to fight against that. I mean, everything from Beethoven's Eroica to Shostakovich, every composer is writing about the things that they care about. It just so happens that as a Black man, I am caring about the scourge of police brutality that is affecting our community in this country. And if my voice is marginalized in this classical music context, you're not going to hear about the things that I care about. And so it's going to seem abnormal. It's going to seem like it's threatening the identity of the genre itself, which is defined by its inequities, by the things that it excludes, unfortunately. And so, yeah, this is a long rambling answer to your question, but it's something I'm definitely thinking about, because I will always write about the things that I care about. I've already written pieces in response to and in processing my grief in response to the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and Tony McDade and George Floyd. And that's just this year. I wrote a piece called Hold Fast to Dream, Setting Some Langston Hughes, that was in response to Alton Sterling and Philando Castile. These are things that I care about. And I would rather not write pieces about every person that dies unjustly. I would like to write about ships pulling into harbor, but it just so happens that when I sit down to write, these things are weighing on my conscience, on my being. To be, Baldwin himself, one of my idols, said to be relatively conscious and to be a Black man in this country is to be a constant rage all the time. So in order to handle that rage in the most healthy way, it comes out in my music. So everything that I'm writing is going to be directly addressing my experience as a Black man in this country. And it just so happens that my experience, my identity is political because, we experience it day to day.
Yeah. And you make an excellent point that in the heat of the moment right now, that might be upsetting to people, but what does that really say about their perspective and where they're at? It's easy to look back 100 years ago or 80 years ago and say, oh, Shostakovich, well, yeah, he was railing against, something that was definitely unjust because it was Stalin and,
Yeah.
far removed from a situation.
Right.
I can empathize with that. But when you're living in it,
Mm-hmm.
much more uncomfortable to kind of acknowledge that.
Right.
So, well, I want to follow up on, your identity as a Black composer. I was asked by a reporter a couple of days ago, as he was doing a story on the talk that you and I are going to give later this weekend out in Cape Cod. And he was a reporter from the Cape Cod local paper, and he said, forgive my ignorance, but I really don't know about this style of choral orchestral music because I haven't really covered it. And he asked me, is it a rarity to have a Black composer and a Black conductor? And I really didn't know how to answer that, because on one hand, I know, and there are, not just I know personally, but there are some very prominent Black composers, including Anthony Davis, who just won the Pulitzer Prize in 2020, and Black conductors as well, doing incredible work in the field. But on the other hand, as you suggested, our field has traditionally been sort of dominated by a European stereotype. And I found that, I thought the very question itself kind of revealed the stereotypes around composers and conductors. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this issue is systemic. There's so many things that we can point to. The fact that, most universities have and colleges have a school of music or a department of music. Music as an art form has existed for since humanity. But all of those schools of music study and focus on a very specific sliver of music. Mm-hmm. There is classical music in so many different regions of the world. Most prominently, probably Indian classical music, the Carnatic tradition and all of that. That's also music, but one might argue, oh, well, you were in America. Why don't we study American music? Well, why don't we study American music? Most of our music that we study in these schools of music is European. Early music for us in America is actually slave song and spirituals and, early Appalachian fiddle tunes. Why aren't we studying that in our schools of music? If we look at the music that is dominating the culture in our country right now, none of that is in our schools of music. So this is a systemic issue, is all I'm bringing all that to say. And it is a rarity that there are, there aren't that many Black conductors and composers. I look at my own journey to this point and look at the roadblocks that popped up and those that I had to sort of somehow circumvent. I had a transcendent experience as a 9-year-old, jumping up and down on my bed, conducting Tchaikovsky's Waltz of the Flowers. Mm-hmm. I, brought in the clarinets, the accelerondo at the end, dun, 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 dun. And my face was wet with tears. And I realized in that moment that, some dead white Russian dude wrote music that would move this little Black boy in the Caribbean to tears. That's the power of music to connect us, regardless of our cultural and ethnic background. And so I wanted to create that experience again. And so I figured I would go to school, and my parents, that's a whole other story. Immigrant parents don't want you to go to be an artist. I was going to be a doctor. So I was,
yeah, so I hear you.
Yeah. I was pre-med and a piano major. That was my way of sneaking it in. And, I wanted to go into conducting, and so many roadblocks. I don't have access to an orchestra. I don't have access to an ensemble or whatever. So I figured I would try composition. I went to a music festival in the South, and it was overall a wonderful experience. But I had an interaction with a racist conductor who laughed at my music on the podium before it was even, a sound was made. And he was fired afterwards, but the damage was already done. I just thought that there was no place for me, because when I look out and I see who are the people that look like me writing music for orchestras today, I couldn't find anyone besides Alvin Singleton, but he was in the Atlanta School of Music, according to Robert Spano. And so his music was championed, but I didn't see anyone else. So I was like, chances are slim there. But I knew of, can you hear me?
I can hear you fine, but your video is a little, there you
go. Okay. I switched to choral conducting because I'd heard of, Andre Thomas, the late Moses Hogan. There were so many examples in the choral conducting field that I could see that looked like me. And so that's why I pursued choral conducting in it, eventually. And I'm wondering, like, what would my career be if early on I had seen more people that looked like me conducting? Maybe I would be in front of an orchestra. Who knows? But I'm not wishing that I didn't take the path that I took. I'm glad I've taken this path. I'm glad I'm doing what I'm doing now. But all that to say that that rarity that the reporter acknowledged is real. There are notable exceptions like Thomas Wilkins and James DePriest, and people who have been in front of major orchestras in this country. But I'm hoping that there's going to be a Black woman someday. Like seeing the La Maestra competition in Paris last week moved me to tears, because I saw someone that looked like my mom or my sister on a podium leading classical music. So yeah, I hope that the inequities that define classical music definitely change, that we can broaden our concept of classical music, especially in this country and in our music educational system, because that's how these things change from the bottom up.
Absolutely. I want to ask you about this idea of performing spirituals. The performance of African American spirituals in this country, in a way it's a long and venerable history, going back over 100 years of choruses performing this music. And yet, particularly in recent years, conductors and ensembles are becoming aware of, how inherently, not sure what the word is, how tricky it can be to sort of navigate waters and perform that music in a way that really sort of honors the source. And is there a way for, in this book that I worked on with Andre, he says explicitly, I think I even have it here, all white choirs singing African American spirituals in a social justice context, as an example of something, he sees happen all the time and sort of, is sort of repulsed by. So what are your thoughts on that? I mean, I think, there's a lot of well-meaning choruses out there, trying to keep this really venerable tradition alive, but probably wondering, how do we do this in a way that's really kind of sensitive and honors the tradition?
Yeah, I think this is a very good question. It's a tricky question. There are so many, Black people are not a monolith. There's so many strains of thought about performance of spiritual in this country among Black, thought. I have friends who completely disagree with my opinions about it. But I think the first step is to acknowledge that the spiritual as a genre is born of trauma, is born of genocide, is born of years of slavery, of the horrendous Middle Passage, of all of the abject horrors that Black people had to face in this country for centuries. That's what the spiritual is born of. And there has been a treatment of the spiritual as this little bonbon that you attach to the end of a choral concert that has a little hint of exoticism, that will show the audience, which is majority white, that we're cool, we're hip, we end with a little ba-dum-ts, right? And it is very offensive to members of the Black community to see music, however joyful, born of suffering, being treated like that on stage. So when we acknowledge that perspective, it makes one turn inward and say, what can we do about it? And I'm glad that choruses are having that conversation. I think choruses should also keep in mind that if something is homogeneously white, it's by design. As if our choruses, let's say if there is a master chorale, like there's an LA master chorale or an Atlanta master chorale, I sang in, or if there's a Providence master chorale, it should be reflective of the community that it's a part of. If there's a Black community in Providence, there should be representation of that community in a chorus that claims to be a cultural institution in that city. That decision alone to make that equitable decision happen on the administration side completely changes the conversation about the performance of these spirituals.
Yes.
I think you can then, as an institution, have these conversations amongst each other and say, should we perform Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child? Is that appropriate for us? You know, these cultural institutions can make these decisions for themselves because they know their community, because they are doing the work to make sure that they are representing the community on stage as well. That's my personal solution to it. I do think that my work, since it is also born of the current Black struggle, is within the tradition of the spiritual. And I wouldn't want Seven Last Words of the Unarmed to be treated like a bonbon at the end. It's very, one needs to program it very carefully, prepare the audience to receive it and help them process it afterwards. It's very tricky to program. As a conductor, I've been thinking like, how would I present my own piece? But that's not my problem. But yeah, it's one has to approach it with the same level of respect and nuance and dignity that you would do Brahms' Lieder. When you're doing, you want to make sure you get all the German right. You want to make sure that you're doing all the nuances appropriate for that specific repertoire. The same care should be taken with spirituals and music that is very American. Not even Africa has the American spiritual. It's born of a very specific trauma.
Yeah. I mean, that's a lot for conductors to think about, and I think that's very enlightening. What you just said, and I wish we had more time to just talk about that, because as a conductor myself, I mean, I'm really interested to talk more about it. Certainly something that I've grappled with as well. Speaking of performances of the Seven Last Words, well, first of all, I just want to say that as our time is drawing to a close, this has been an intro to you and your work, but we're really hoping to have you back up here in Providence when the campus is a little more open.
Yeah.
And I would love to think about, a performance of this piece up here. I think that there are probably many people, singers in the Providence area, that would be thrilled to participate in such a performance. And I think that'd be amazing. I want to take a question from my wonderful colleague, Mike Fitzer, who's the choral director out at the University of Albany, and joining us tonight in the Q&A. I think you can see the question. He said, Mike says, Joel and Krishan, thank you so much for this important and compelling conversation. At U Albany, we are making a recording of Amadou Diallo's movement. And we've had some very necessary and sometimes difficult conversations. Do you have advice for approaching these stories and recognizing the heartbreak and the empathy that you mentioned without particularly forcing the Black singers to go to that darkest place you mentioned. In other words, how do you present this to your ensemble and really kind of get into the spirit of the piece without necessarily having to reawaken trauma that, might already be there?
Right. That's a great question. At the premiering ensemble, the Michigan Glee Club, many of the Black members talked about their first time interacting with the piece and recognizing that it was tearing down walls that, we erect in order to navigate white spaces. We keep those things, we don't talk about those things in mixed company, as it were, but we're so used to code switching and sort of diminishing or suppressing our own Blackness in order to successfully navigate those spaces. And so all of a sudden, here comes this piece in which it fully acknowledges our identity. And that can sort of re-trigger trauma and all those negative feelings and going to that dark place. So I totally understand, but I think the solution to all of this is transparency, acknowledging the difficulty that it takes, giving people a choice to either be a part of it or not, centering their voice, letting them know that you, as a pedagogue, as the person running this space, which is a very vulnerable space, acknowledge the vulnerability it requires for them as Black singers to engage with this piece in a predominantly white setting. That alone, that acknowledgement, does wonders. That's happened a few times in my life where someone's just surprised me and just said, I figured that this might be how you're feeling. Just know that I care about you. I acknowledge that. If this is too uncomfortable, you have an out. I respect that. That does so much. Yeah.
I have a question here from one of our students here at Providence College, Mackenzie Cochran. She asks, when you were selecting the text, did you know which words or which last words you're going to use, or did you select them based off Jesus's language? So in other words, I guess, how did the structure of this, how rigid was that structure of the 7 last words to influence the way you chose to set the text?
Yeah, I really base it on the liturgy. So those decisions were made before I wrote a single note. Like I had mentioned earlier, that it was based off of, I have a rationale for each one of those decisions, but I was looking at, Shirin Barghi's collection of last words is much more extensive than 7. So I just chose the best ones that matched the liturgy.
Yeah, cool. Great question, Mackenzie. And finally, I think we probably only have time for one more question. Do you want to speak to this, or what do you wish you could say now to the young Black boy in the Caribbean who is now conducting your music? Tchaikovsky.
Yeah. Well, first of all, they should keep in touch. They should contact me. Wow, what would I say? Just follow that instinct. I think I think the reason that my journey to this point has been so circuitous has been, it's because there's been a process of seeking honesty. First, the honesty to myself, being honest with myself. I really did pursue the medical path to appease my parents for so long. Took the MCAT, got a good score, shadowed my uncle, who's an OBGYN in Jamaica, helped deliver a baby. I went all in, but I was not being honest with myself. I am a musician, and so I would encourage that young Black boy in the Caribbean conducting my music through tears to pursue that they can be a part of those same transcendent experiences, full of to create spaces of honesty for yourself and also for other people to engage in healing. If I think that I'm still, the impulse towards medicine was to be engaged in the act of healing on a personal level, but I feel like I'm still doing the same thing on a just like a public health scale, I suppose. And I don't mean that in any arrogance. It's something that I'm actively centering in my craft. I want what I write to be healing, to provide moments of transcendence, because I do think that's healing, and connection itself, connection to other people, both listeners and performers on stage. That connection is healing. In an age of so much disconnection, so much discord, and fake news tearing at our concept of reality, I think it's the composer's job, the artist's job, to tell the truth. There is not a lot of truth nowadays, and so that connection to the truth, one's personal truth, to the truth of the situation, is what I center in my craft. And I think that provides healing, that provides transcendence. So to that young Black boy, do the same.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so wonderful to hear you talk about that, your view of the composer's role in society as being someone who can provide those opportunities for healing and transcendence. Again, I think everything that we hope that our music will do for people, you're doing it for sure. So thank you so much for sharing it with us. We're out of time, unfortunately. Ask you, I believe you're off to Houston next week for a project.
Yeah.
Maybe you can just give us a few words about your upcoming project.
Sure. Yeah, I'm going to be recording my opera, The Snowy Day. It was scheduled to be premiered this December, but it got moved to next December because of COVID, obviously. But we're still trying to record an album and workshop it, and they're making a documentary about it, making an opera in the time of COVID. And so I'll be going down to Houston, quarantining for a little bit, and then recording. And so, yeah, I'm really excited. It was a very healing experience for me, to be honest, working on that, because a lot of my music is sort of dealing with these heavy issues, but it's based on a children's book by Ezra Jack Keats that was published in 1963, and it's notable that it was the first mainstream children's picture book to feature a Black protagonist. It doesn't mention his race at all, but it's just a little Black boy in a red hoodie having fun in the snow. And so I got to look through Peter's eyes, that's the name of the boy, over the course of writing the piece, and it's eyes of wonder, looking at the world in a sense of wonder rather than fear, which is, admittedly something that I do myself, look at the world in fear and respond to it. But writing an opera about a little Black boy in a red hoodie having fun in the snow without being killed is just as much a part of my social justice mission as Seven Last Words of the Unarmed. So it's very much still a part of the mission of my craft. And I'm so glad that it's happy, uplifting, joyous music that can get different families into an opera house, hopefully. So that's the goal, that's the aim.
Absolutely. Well, yeah. I'm looking forward to hearing the opera as well.
Yeah. Well, I'll keep you posted.
No, please do. Yeah. Thank you again so much, Joel, for being with us here tonight at Providence College.
My pleasure.
Really appreciate your presence and all your insightful remarks. And we're going to stay in touch for sure, and looking forward to having you on campus in person, hopefully in the not too distant future.
Yes, definitely.
All right. Thank you to the Institution for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Homecoming, and college events, as well as my colleagues in the music department, for supporting this event and for helping us to bring Joel here. Really appreciate everybody's support and for being here with us tonight for this important conversation. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you for listening to the Providence College Podcast. Episodes are available in all of the usual places, as well as the college's YouTube channel and on your smart speaker. For producer Chris Judge, I'm Liz Kay. Until next time.